without wanting to go into detail about some of the anatomical stuff, which is there are words in your book that I would not say on the podcast, even though generally we're not one for censoring on the podcast. But there are some very rude words which are in circulation, including in medical texts sometimes, and also some very interesting ideas about sexual difference between men and women, because you do have doctors noticing, or anatomists noticing, the fact that there are some ways in which the male and female reproductive systems are kind of strangely mirror each other, like the fact that there are two testes and two ovaries and so on. So you sometimes see shared words, like I think stones is one of the words that's used to describe both testes and ovaries, and the idea of the vagina maybe being an inverted penis, and all this thinking about how do you understand sexual difference once we've actually started anatomizing people, and seeing some of the unexpected similarities between the two sets of organs.
That was another sort of complicated set of narratives where there was, you will read certain historians citing Thomas Laqueur's one-sex theory, that sort of predominate through this period, the people are not thinking in terms of two sexes, but sort of two varieties of one sex, a kind of, which are inverses of each other. But I think what I found is that's only one narrative amongst others, and it's to misrepresent history, to assume that was what was understood widely. It would be more accurate to think of it as kind of one academic theory among many, and we have to be very careful with that idea of inverse. There's a strand of thinking from Galen onwards, very helpful for male medics in training who know their own bodies, but maybe in the world of kind of clerical celibacy, maybe much less familiar with women's bodies, who it helps to tell them, this is like this, think of this as a kind of reverse of this. But it might, those homologies, as they're called, might simply be as if, or like. And there's another strand of thinking all the way through this period, which is very clear, that human bodies are alike in some ways, but different in other ways, and you have to take those differences into account. And you can make a very broad brush and engaging narrative to say, oh, the past thought like this. But I've drawn on the work of some really amazing historians of medicine and history of science who've gone back and kind of checked out this idea of one sex, and find it's always challenged. It doesn't appear across all domains at certain periods. It's being described, even in the 16th century, as ridiculous and absurd, the idea that everything is a kind of inverse of everything else. Sometimes even in texts where they, you find this in modern academia today, they give a kind of, they acknowledge the theory and then do a completely different set of things, which make it clear that they must think of something other than simple homology. So and it mattered for my book because one of Laqueur's pieces of evidence is that there aren't really words for female sexual anatomy in the vernacular, and that's because everyone's thinking in terms of kind of, oh, it's inverses. Well, that's true in the case of stones, ovaries, testicles, and it's partly because medical science hasn't quite worked out, well, won't work out for several centuries, how ovulation fits into this. So if you assume that men have seed and women have seed, it makes sense for those two to be described in very similar terms. But for other body parts, including all of those words which I've been carefully not saying when I've been on the radio, things like that, they're not always being described in this homologous way, and that they're quite, many experts of their time are quite clear that the homologies don't really work, as it were. They, what's the womb in this? How does it all fit together? It would be better to think of those statements as a kind of pretty out there theory of early medicine than the kind of way that the whole society thinks. And I was interested to try and um, correct that narrative a bit, and to show that there are words and ways of writing about the need to take account of sexuate difference, that kind of divided the human body into two sexes.
I always found the Lequeur thesis very confusing when I was an undergraduate. The idea that, I mean, my initial interpretation of it was that, okay, so before the Enlightenment, people didn't know that men and women existed. Okay, which of course is not quite what he's saying, but
No.
I guess the idea is that yes, the idea is that there was greater emphasis in medical writing for the Enlightenment on similarities between the sexes anatomically, and then greater emphasis post-Enlightenment on differences between the sexes. But yeah, as you say, that there have always been different currents of thinking in play at any one time, and that simple narrative doesn't really map onto the way that people are actually thinking and writing at this period.
Yeah, and motivated reasoning is important. Who might be saying this, and why, and what particularly, even thinking about things like genre and what type of text this is. I mean, there's kind of things we understand as theory, but if the theory is clearly not mapping onto the practice, um, then it's not really convincing as an account of an idea that's kind of culture wide. I think that the latter part of it is the bit that's helpful. That there is science and medicine, 18th century, 19th century. Again, it's not neutral. It has various reasons why might want to kind of reinforce the sex binary, and to derive certain conclusions from the way in which they're now framing the difference between the sexes. And we can look at those, but you can tell that story without needing to kind of misrepresent what the Middle Ages and the Renaissance think. And it's very noticeable in that book that it has a set of theoretical models from the classical period, and then it jumps to a point in the Renaissance when those classical models are having a revival, and for quite a brief period of time have a certain sort of interest. I mean, it's sort of the opposite in a way to the kind of new anatomical work that's going on, the kind of actual dissection. People are starting to kind of play around with different ideas, but Lacan is not careful enough about what happens in the middle, and what you can find if you look at kind of English writing about medicine and about human anatomy and reproduction. It works if you take a jump, as many histories do, across the medieval, and even across some of the things that are going on in the Renaissance. And I mean, that chapter took the longest and was the most difficult, because I wanted to get that story as informed as it could be from the work that's been done by many excellent academic historians of medicine and science, from the publication of that book through the next 30 years. But I get a bit frustrated that it's still trotted out as a kind of great fact about the pre-modern world. You know, I got an Anglo-Saxon translator in the year 1000 saying there is a great difference between prepubertal and adult bodies, and between male and female bodies.
Yeah, they knew what was what. I mean, it is amazingly easy, particularly when we're looking at something like, well, medicine would be a prime example, as I've already said, that to be really condescending towards people of the past, and to assume that they were foolish and had mad ideas that we now sort of objectively recognise to be false. But it's hard to tug oneself away from that. There's a very strong kind of present centrism that is hard to forget.
the good thing about writing as someone who teaches in my day job Old English literature, medieval literature, I think there is a tendency, especially people who are working 18th, 19th century, to kind of look back and make some of their stories by slightly kind of suppressing or not quite taking the time to kind of work out what was actually going on, because the sources are difficult and the language can be difficult. So um, even though I teach in the English literature department, and part of the fun of writing this book was sort of catching up on a lot of kind of feminist history and gender studies material from the time since I was an undergraduate. But it did seem to me to be helpful to be someone who looks kind of from the beginning of English thoughts, and knows that there's stuff there to be found in dictionaries and in the way in which Latin and French expert writings, the writings of authorities, are being put into English, and what you might find if you sort of work through those texts, and that might be a richer story. Yes, the past is wrong about many things, but wrong in ways that we should think carefully, really carefully about. And I could see almost a kind of more plural way of thinking that then rather gets kind of narrowed in. Um, this is the kind of classic medievalist view that actually it's not the Renaissance, it's the narrowing of the kind of losing of a kind of rich mix of ideas that jostle around as we head towards kind of more monotonous narratives, I think.
Yeah, I think medievalists are justified in feeling quite irritated by the. I mean, we literally use the word medieval as a synonym for bad, brutal, and wrong. So yes.